I never expected a Mother's Day morning to be the moment my entire family collapsed. But when my phone buzzed at 9, and I saw what Sandra had posted to all 26 members of our family group chat, something inside me went completely still. Not the stillness of shock or hurt, but the kind of cold, focused clarity that only comes when you have spent years training your mind to spot the exact shape of a lie. The PDF she sent was titled "The Cost of Raising a Disappointment," formatted like a real invoice, itemized with surgical precision, braces from my childhood, 18 years of groceries multiplied and compounded, electricity, water, even the community college tuition I had paid entirely on my own, while she refused to contribute a single dollar. The final line, printed in bold red, listed emotional damages for failure to secure a high-earning husband. The total was $467,000, with a demand for payment by Friday or permanent exile from the family. My name is Callie Renner. I am 32 years old, a forensic accountant based in Chicago, and that morning I did not cry. I opened my laptop and started working. Here is the first thing they teach you in forensic accounting. Nobody fabricates a number like 467,000. When people invent emotional debts, they round up, they go theatrical. They demand 500,000 or an even 100,000. A figure that specific does not come from grief or resentment. It comes from a real ledger, an actual financial hole that needs to be filled. And a Friday deadline is not a dramatic touch. It is a real deadline tied to a real consequence. Within about 30 seconds of reading that invoice, I understood that Sandra was not performing cruelty for its own sake. She was panicking, and she needed cash fast. While my aunts and uncles and cousins flooded the group chat with commentary, some condemning her, most piling onto me, I muted every notification and began pulling public property records for her address. If my mother suddenly needed nearly $500,000 by the end of the week, her carefully maintained image of financial stability was fracturing somewhere underneath the surface. And real estate is almost always where desperate people go first. That same afternoon, my brother Grant showed up at the marble lobby of my firm, dressed like someone auditioning for a role in a television show about tech entrepreneurs. He was loud, theatrical, and absolutely certain that shaming me in front of my colleagues would accomplish something. He demanded I write a check or face humiliation. I let him finish, then reminded him quietly that I had personally wired his rent for 3 consecutive years, while his revolutionary company produced zero revenue and zero product. His arrogance crumbled into fury fast, and building security escorted him toward the exit. But right before the glass doors closed behind him, he shouted something that shifted the entire direction of my investigation. He screamed that the house was on the line because of me, and in that single sentence, he accidentally handed me everything. Sandra had always made a point of telling people she owned her home outright. If that house was suddenly at risk, she had borrowed against it in secret. Back at my desk, the county database delivered the confirmation within minutes. A $200,000 home equity line of credit, opened 18 months ago, with a notice of default filed just 3 weeks earlier. The bank was already moving toward foreclosure. But here was the problem with that number. If Sandra only needed enough to stop foreclosure, she would have demanded exactly 200,000, not 467. The gap between those two numbers was $267,000 of something else entirely, something unaccounted for and deeply hidden. I wrote the equation on a legal pad in large numbers and stared at it for a long time. Then I started tracing the home equity funds through public corporate filings, and what I found made everything click into place with a sickening kind of precision. The money had flowed directly into a Delaware LLC called Vantage Peak Holdings, registered 18 months ago to a single managing member. My brother Grant had not secured investors. He had convinced our mother to mortgage her house to fund a fantasy, and he had spent every dollar of it on a matte black sports car, first-class flights, 5-star networking retreats, and a cryptocurrency investment that lost 95% of its value before he pulled out. The house money was gone, burned completely by his ego and her enabling. But $267,000 was still unaccounted for, and Sandra had no other visible assets, no secondary property, no stocks. There was only one other significant pool of money left anywhere in our family, and the moment I realized it, I felt genuinely sick. My grandmother Dorothy had an irrevocable medical trust, established by my late grandfather, to guarantee her care for the remainder of her life. Sandra had been installed as trustee after his death. Trustees carry a fiduciary duty that is not flexible or negotiable. Draining a medical trust is not a civil matter. It is a federal crime. I checked the probate court's public docket and found that the state-mandated annual audit of Dorothy's trust was scheduled for May 28, 14 days from that morning. The entire timeline snapped into focus. Sandra had drained the house for Grant. Grant had lost every dollar. The bank came calling. And rather than confess, she had reached into her own mother's care fund and pulled out the difference, gambling that she could replace it before the auditors ever arrived. The invoice was not about wounded feelings. It was a calculated extortion attempt designed to cover two collapsing financial ledgers before federal scrutiny arrived. I had not visited my grandmother in almost 2 years. Sandra had moved her to a new assisted living facility in the northern suburbs and had tightly controlled every aspect of access. I took a cab out that same afternoon, bluffed my way past the front desk by mentioning the upcoming audit by name, and found Dorothy in a sunlit corner room, frail in her chair but with eyes that were sharp and completely alert. She was not surprised to see me. She looked relieved in the way someone looks when they have been waiting for rescue and finally hear footsteps in the hall. She told me Sandra had visited just days earlier, sobbing that the stock market had collapsed and wiped out the trust entirely, warning Dorothy she might have to relocate to a state facility within the week. It was a lie designed specifically to explain away the missing balance before auditors could ask questions. When I told her the truth, that the money had not been lost but stolen, that her own daughter had forged her signature on a wire transfer to move funds into Grant's offshore account, Dorothy's fear did not dissolve into tears. It hardened into something I recognized immediately as fury. She reached into her dresser drawer and pulled out a manila envelope Sandra had never managed to confiscate. Inside were bank statements Dorothy had quietly kept hidden, along with something far more damning. A wire transfer authorization written in Sandra's handwriting, moving exactly $267,000 from the trust to a Cayman Islands account belonging to Vantage Peak Holdings. At the bottom was Dorothy's signature, but it was not Dorothy's signature. The forgery was imprecise in a way that was obvious to anyone who held it next to a genuine sample. Sandra had committed felony forgery layered on top of felony embezzlement, and Dorothy had been sitting on the evidence for weeks, waiting for someone trustworthy enough to bring it to. We agreed on an approach together. Dorothy would continue playing along, pretending to believe the story about the crashed market, while I scanned every document into an encrypted legal dossier that same night. That evening, Sandra escalated dramatically in the group chat. She announced a mandatory family dinner at an upscale steakhouse on Friday, the identical deadline from her invoice, and threatened to formally and permanently disown me if I arrived without a check in hand. I responded with a single word confirming my attendance, offered no argument, no defense, and no explanation, because she had just selected the exact location I needed. Friday night I dressed the way I dress when I walk into a deposition, quietly authoritative and completely unreadable. The private dining room held all 26 relatives, arranged around a long table with one conspicuously empty chair positioned at the far end like a witness stand. Sandra sat at the head in a dark dress that communicated mourning. Grant sat beside her with the smug expression of someone who believed the performance was already over. I pulled out my chair, sat down, looked directly at Sandra, and said, "Good evening, let us begin." I used her first name deliberately, and a ripple of audible discomfort moved around the table instantly. She launched into an extended monologue about sacrifice and maternal suffering, and the family performed right alongside her. My Aunt Roberta clutched her necklace. My Uncle Dennis declared I owed everything to the woman who raised me. My cousin Piper called me a disgrace to the family name. Grant stood and threatened a lawsuit, demanding I liquidate my savings to replenish the trust of the very woman currently suing me. I allowed them to exhaust themselves for 5 complete minutes, because I needed every person in that room fully committed to the lie before I exposed it. When Dennis finally demanded an answer, I said calmly that I had no intention of writing a check to someone facing federal charges for embezzling from her own mother's medical trust. Then I unlocked my phone and sent one image to the family group chat. 26 phones buzzed simultaneously. The image was a forensic collage I had assembled the night before. The bank foreclosure notice with the $200,000 balance circled in red. Below it, the wire transfer authorization in Sandra's handwriting moving $267,000 from Dorothy's trust to the Cayman account, with the forged signature clearly visible. and centered between them, the arithmetic laid out plainly. 200,000 plus 267,000 equaled 467,000. The exact figure from the invoice. The room transformed completely. Dennis, who was a secondary beneficiary of the trust and recognized the routing numbers immediately, went the color of old chalk. Roberta's hands shook as she scrolled through the image on her phone. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and told the table plainly that Sandra had mortgaged her house to fund Grant's fraudulent company, that he had spent every dollar on personal luxury and failed investments, and that when the bank came calling, she had forged her own mother's signature to steal the remainder from a protected medical account. Grant immediately began throwing Sandra under the bus, insisting he had never known the source of the funding. Sandra shrieked that the documents were fabricated. Nobody in that room was listening to either of them anymore. I walked out through the double doors and did not look back. In the car, I watched the group chat disintegrate in real time. Dennis left first with a message that burned 3 lines long. Roberta followed. Cousin after cousin dropped out with parting words that ranged from disgusted to furious, blocking Sandra and Grant across every platform they shared. Within 20 minutes the chat had collapsed from 26 members to 3. Sandra, Grant, and me. I removed myself, blocked them both completely, and noticed in that moment that Dorothy had never posted a single word and had never left the chat. Because you do not block the contact information of someone you are actively building a federal case against. The legal response arrived that same weekend. Dorothy's attorney filed an emergency injunction stripping Sandra of her trustee status and forwarded the forged wire authorization to federal prosecutors. Because the funds had crossed into a Cayman Islands account, the case immediately became a federal wire fraud matter. By Monday morning, Grant's bank accounts were frozen, the cryptocurrency holdings were seized, and the sports car was impounded as an asset purchased with stolen funds. Sandra was facing eviction and a mandatory minimum sentence for elder financial abuse combined with criminal forgery, with absolutely no leverage remaining to negotiate her way out. Days after the raid, she called from an unknown number, crying that federal agents had taken her computer, that Grant was sleeping on her couch with nothing left, begging me to retain a defense attorney on her behalf and persuade Dorothy to withdraw the charges. I listened to the entire voicemail once without a single flicker of guilt, deleted it, and blocked the number. She was not remorseful about what she had done. She was only devastated that it had been documented and exposed. The following weekend I visited Dorothy properly, not by bluffing past a front desk but as a permanent approved visitor welcomed in by name. She poured tea from a small silver service she kept on a side table, and told me the court had frozen every account, the embezzlement charges were advancing through the federal system, and the trust was finally secure and protected. We talked about her late husband, about my work, about the city in spring, 2 people simply enjoying each other without a shadow of manipulation hanging between them, without anyone controlling the visit or the conversation. For most of my adult life, I had been the designated scapegoat in a family that ran entirely on manipulation, conditioned from childhood to believe that love was a debt I carried and could never quite repay. But I had used the exact skills that family had dismissed and belittled to expose every number, trace every transfer, and dismantle the entire structure they had built on top of that belief. I felt no triumph watching it collapse. What I felt was quieter and more permanent than triumph. It was the sensation of a scale finally finding its true balance after decades of being held artificially tilted. Some of the heaviest invoices we are handed in life are ones we never actually owed. The only way to clear them is to stop paying on demand and start examining the books. 6 months later, my apartment smelled like roasted garlic and good wine, and the laughter of people I had genuinely chosen filled every room. Colleagues and friends who had stood beside me through the entire ordeal gathered to celebrate the launch of my own independent firm. I raised a glass and understood with complete clarity what the whole experience had taught me. Loyalty demanded at the cost of your own dignity is not love. It is exploitation dressed in family language. Real power was never in the screaming or the spectacle. It was in the quiet preparation, the documented facts, and the refusal to participate in someone else's carefully constructed delusion. Blood creates relatives. Integrity and mutual respect create family. I did not lose mine. I simply finally chose it.